Well, hello there, everyone. Welcome to Accessibility Talks, the monthly virtual meetup where we chat about digital accessibility, inclusivity, and usability. Each month, we invite a speaker to present on a topic, and afterwards, we invite the community to ask questions and participate in the discussion. I'm your host today, Mark Casillas. I work at Canopy Studios as a Drupal technical lead and community developer. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and my pronouns are he and him. Before we get too far into the talk, I wanted to let you know we have live transcripts available thanks to Anne today. And if you go to bit.ly/A11yTalks with the 2 1s dash transcriptions, look for the link in the chat, or you can look for the link in the chat, which is being put up there. And you can also enable YouTube closed captioning if that works better for you. It's all up to you, right? We also have a code of conduct. Let's take a moment to remind everybody. We want to keep our group to provide a friendly and safe environment. We require all participants, this includes speakers, hosts, those watching on YouTube, and folks commenting on social networks to adhere to Accessibility Talks Code of Conduct. This applies to everything, please, and thank you. All verbal questions, all text in the chat. If you have any questions about it, the code of conduct can be found on our website, alleytalks.com, and all participants should be able to engage in a productive dialogue, and they should share and learn with an atmosphere of mutual respect, please, and thank you. Want to give a shout out to our Alley Cat Club members. Thank you very much for your monthly financial contributions. And if you want to join the Alley Cats, you want to see your name on that list there, visit our website and go, or alleytalks.com, and that's with the ones, not the L's, alleytalks.com/pages/sponsorship. And you can join the club too, and that'd be great. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the hashtag AlleyTalks. That's A11yTalks, or type in the chat window on your YouTubes. It can be busy in the chat, so preface the question with the word question so that we can figure it out on our own. And then, of course, at the end of the presentation, we'll take the questions because we'll have some time for questions and answers, or Q&A, if you would like to say. So today we have Matthew Saunders, director at Pfizer. I got a couple fun facts about Matthew. First off, how you doing, buddy?
Yeah, real good. Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Good. Matthew and I, since he's just north of New Mexico, we do see each other at a variety of talks and camps and cons. There are a couple fun facts about Matthew. One, he holds 3 citizenships. He's Canadian, he's Britain, and United Statesian. I don't think that's a real word. I don't know why I wrote it down like that. Anyway, fun fact number 2, no degrees in software engineering. His undergrad is in studio art with a minor in theater, and then a certificate of arts in administration, and then a master's of fine arts in theater, which is always fun when you have that kind of a degree and then you go do something completely different, right?
Well, the funny thing is that, and I'm not going to go into that in this talk, but a lot of what I learned in the theater was directly applicable to the work that I do today in technology. So sometimes these skills really actually overlap quite nicely.
Very cool. And then fun fact number 3, he's visited 49 of the 50 states and the District of Columbia. No word on Puerto Rico, though.
I have not been to Puerto Rico.
Okay, so what state are you missing?
I am missing Mississippi.
Oh, are you really? No, just kidding.
Yep.
All right.
Yep.
So today he's going to present the human side of neurodivergence, a technologist journey. And at this point, I'm going to be quiet and say, take it away, Matthew.
Okay, thank you very much. First off, I want to thank Alley Talks for inviting me to come and speak with you. Really excited for this opportunity, and it helps me push forward my own advocacy for folks who are neurodivergent, particularly in the technology community. My name is Matthew Saunders, and I've known since I was very small that I was different. And back then, we didn't call it neurodivergence or learning differences. People like me were called learning disabled. And my disabilities were considered bad enough that I was legally entitled to accommodations from the Canadian and Ontario governments where I lived at the time. I've been part of the Drupal community. Hold on a second. I don't know why this isn't moving. Hold on. I apologize. There we go. I've been part of the Drupal community since 2006. I attended my first DrupalCon in 2007. I'm one of the founders of Drupal Camp Colorado. I sat on the Drupal Association Board of Directors for 2.5 years between 2013 and 2016. I've helped found the event organizers working group in the Drupal community, and I'm the founder and currently the chair for Drupal Colorado Incorporated. And as Mark mentioned, I work for Pfizer in digital in a director role. Now, way back in 2019, I did a presentation at DrupalCon Amsterdam that touched on my neurodivergence while telling the story of my journey. It was called Pivot Points, Recognizing Opportunity, Turning Challenges to Strengths. And I'd spent quite a few years at that point researching my own daughter's challenges. We adopted her from social services at the age of 5. And her experiences before she came to us had been traumatic. She'd had 8 sets of caregivers before she came to us, and she'd had a really rough go of it. So I read and I went to classes and seminars because I personally needed to understand as much as I could about her neurodivergence so I could be her advocate. She has bipolar disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, reactive attachment disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And for me, doing this research led to light bulb after light bulb after light bulb going off in my own head as I started to recognize a lot about myself in that research. And in a very real way, if it hadn't been for my daughter, I would have just continued coping, and I never would have understood my own ADHD and dyslexia, and I certainly wouldn't have had the explosive realization that I was on the autism spectrum. Personally, I figured out most of my coping mechanisms by the time I went to university in 1989. A few I didn't sort out until I had cancer in 2000. But the truth is, I didn't really understand why I was different until much later. My personal epiphanies occurred between 2005 and 2017. And since then, I've spent time reflecting and refining my own self-understanding. Now, in that Amsterdam presentation, I talked a lot about my journey to being a technology leader, despite my challenges. And a large reason that my journey was challenging was my lack of diagnosis of my cognitive differences. I also had a battle with cancer as a young man, and that profoundly changed the way I see the world. That cancer, in a very strange way, might well be related to my learning differences, and I'll talk about that a little later in the chat. Now, I'm particularly lucky because my parents saved many of the diagnostic documents that were prepared for me in the 1970s and 1980s. And what this practically meant to me is that I could filter those documents through the lens of the 21st century's understanding of mental health morbidities. As I go on in this talk, I want to say that this is my lived experience. I'm giving you insights into what's worked for me, where my primary struggles have landed, and while there's a recognizable pattern for folks who are neurodivergent, every single one of us is different. That said, I'm going to try and generalize these observations because my main goal of this talk is to help people who are neurotypical understand atypicals a bit better and provide some insight into how you can better relate and communicate both from a typical and the atypical point of view. I want to add that my identity in the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion is sort of a pretzel. I see myself as being an ally, being a cisgendered white guy, but I'm also keenly aware that my own status as a disabled person puts me very much within the DEI community itself. And my hope is that both of these aspects of my life are a force for inclusion. As a child, I was diagnosed with reversal problem, with extremely short attention span, anger issues, and inflexibility. I was labeled as being oppositional. Abrupt sudden noises were and are painful to me. I experienced sensory overload easily. It was observed that my visual motor integration was poor, and in the 1970s, there wasn't the vocabulary, the sophistication, or the understanding to really understand my challenges. In today's terms, I would have been diagnosed differently. I would have been diagnosed with dyslexia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and the spectrum now includes what was called Asperger's before. I grew up in Canada, though, and autism wasn't diagnosed there until 1980. And even so, I wouldn't have fit into that diagnosis for that time period, as it was used to describe much more significant deficits. And Asperger's wasn't recognized in Canada, where I grew up, until the 1990s. And I would add, when you've got multiple disorders, comorbidity can make it very difficult to identify what causes what. However, one of the mental health professionals that's worked with me shared it often doesn't matter what the diagnoses are. It's more important to treat the recognizable symptoms. So as we go through some of this, I'm going to talk about symptoms and strategies around symptoms. As a side note, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM, no longer recognizes the label Asperger's. In 2013, it was removed and folded into autism spectrum disorder. And I think that was because it was discovered that Dr. Asperger played a critical role in identifying children with disabilities during the racial hygiene measures of the Third Reich. And many of those children were sent to Spiegelgrund in Vienna, where they were sometimes euthanized or used as subjects of experiments. And that association has been pretty upsetting to some members of my community. That said, many folks in the community were also highly suspicious of the diagnosis being rolled into autism spectrum disorder. So this brings me to my first small insight for you. If someone shares with you that they're neurodivergent and they describe themselves as having Asperger's, be sensitive to refer to it in that way with that person, because that's how they identify. Lots of us call ourselves Aspies. Likewise, if they share that they're on the spectrum, there's a very good chance that they don't identify with the label Asperger's. So try to be sensitive to that. When I was 3, I had a little red tricycle that I adored. I would beg my family to put me on the saddle. And once I was sitting on that trike, I would just sit on it and I would scream. And my parents couldn't figure out why I would just sit there and holler at the top of my lungs. It took me over a year to learn how to ride it. In 1977, I was identified educationally as a high-risk child due to delays in high-end coordination, spatial relations, motor visual, and visual memory. It was this reason that I would sit and scream. I couldn't figure out how to make my legs turn in the front wheel. Now, the point of this is that people on the spectrum can be angered quickly and they can have difficulty calming themselves. We need to learn skills to cope with an increase in irritability. But first, we must be able to identify these emotions. Dr. Kelly Blankenship and Dr. Noha F. Minashawi of the National Library of Medicine wrote, individuals with high-functioning autism spectrum disorders also exhibit difficulty modulating their anger, which may lead to further difficulties in their social interactions. Because they have difficulty interpreting their own subtle changes in emotion, they are often only able to describe emotional extremes. I simply couldn't express my frustration in a normal way, and this led to extreme outbursts. My emotions were either seemed elated or they seemed extremely angry, and there didn't really seem to be much in between. This would continue well into my teenage years. And because of that, I had very few friends. They couldn't identify with me. As a young boy, I would often get into verbal and sometimes physical altercations with my peers, despite being very, very small for my age. I would become enraged if I felt I was being wronged or insulted. And children are cruel. So rather than trying to help me calm down, they found it so funny to just wind me up until I was a complete mess. In grades 7 and 8, in an attempt to sort out my learning difficulties, but also to cater to my intelligence, I ended up being enrolled both in the gifted and remedial programs at the same time. This meant I didn't fit in anywhere. I didn't fit in with the gifted kids because I was in the remedial program. I didn't fit in with the remedial kids because I was in the gifted program. I didn't have anything in common with the kids in regular classes. So for me, it was a very lonely time that ran all the way through high school. This had social impacts of its own that didn't really resolve until university. However, it did save me from being relegated solely to the remedial program, and this strategy quite likely saved me from being dependent on others for the rest of my life. As I got older, I was baffled by how people reacted to me. I wanted to figure out why I had trouble keeping friends. And finally, what worked for me was journaling in the moment. When I found myself being happy or angry or sad or excited, I would stop, take a deep breath, and identify where those emotions were coming from. I kept a small notebook with me for significant time, and I would journal in that moment. I needed to start understanding cause and effect. I had to pinpoint why I felt angry, happy, or sad, and what the reactions were of other people in those circumstances. So, in the last 2 years before going to university, I managed to identify what self-destructive behaviors around other people actually looked like. And I began short-circuiting them, using reason rather than instinct. The social impact of being an experiment by mixing remedial and gifted programs was on its way to resolving itself by the time I attended university. And when I arrived, nobody knew who I was. I realized that I could completely reimagine myself without any stigmas that had built up through middle school and high school. At Bishop's University, I learned that you can define your own identity. I learned that when you're redefining yourself, you can fake it until you make it. That exercise of writing down everything that I was feeling, when and why, allowed me to flourish both academically and socially during this time. People liked me, and it was perhaps for the first time in my life. I would note that these feelings of anger that I talked about are nearly never directed personally to another person. And they fade, and it happens very quickly. I have no feelings of animosity towards the people that it might have seemed the anger was directed. And this can be extremely confusing for the other person or persons, because they don't understand how somebody can 180 so quickly. It can also be confusing for the neurodivergent person, because they can't conceive of why people are still upset with them after they've let go of all the irritability. To this day, my emotions are extreme. I use a variety of self-soothing techniques to smooth things inwardly and outwardly. Sometimes this manifests itself as box breathing, or sometimes it's light tapping on the opposite shoulders, repetitive movements, and sometimes using fidget. When you work with those on the spectrum, please consider their feelings can manifest very differently than yours. They may feel very deeply about things you wouldn't expect. You might be surprised by what they feel so deeply about. So avoid approaching this as overreaction. That will simply make things more challenging. But none of this makes those feelings any less valid or real. So for me, I found it totally fine. If somebody comes up to me and says, "Hey, what's up? What are you feeling? Why do you feel that way?" I'm happy to talk about these things as long as my feelings aren't dismissed. So if you're in a long-term personal or professional relationship with somebody who's neurodivergent, try to learn what triggers are likely to lead to extremes. You can help an awful lot just by understanding. I experience the same extremes in emotion at the other end too, joy. The Asperger's Autism Network writes, many feelings such as fear, anger, joy seem to be experienced more intensely by those with Asperger's profiles than average people. In addition, some individuals with Asperger's profiles report that they deeply internalize others' feelings, so that if someone else is upset, they themselves quickly become upset as well. I feel joy unbelievably deeply. And I remember as a choir boy when I was a child, sitting in places like St. John the Divine in New York, feeling like it was the great maker filling me. When I visited Coventry Cathedral, the juxtaposition of the bombed out church from the Blitz and the new building that had been purposefully built in integration with the old, well, I was brought to tears. I've been to two DrupalCons in Barcelona and attended La Merced festival at both. At both times, I stood under these fireworks, absorbing joy directly from the lights. Also, in both instances, I needed to leave because the stimulus became too intense and I was overwhelmed. A couple of years ago, I became certified as an open water scuba diver. And the pure joy that I feel when I'm swimming with turtles, sharks, rays, and fish amongst forests of coral is all encompassing. So I feel deeply. And these feelings can be overwhelming. As a child, it was observed that I had a massive vocabulary and an excellent word discrimination compared to others in my age group. My verbal IQ was scored at the 99.8 percentile, and my overall IQ was in the 98th percentile. However, traditional learning was very difficult for me. It was recommended that you should treat Matthew as if he were hard of hearing and maintain eye contact while giving oral instructions. And his attention span is so short and he is so easily distracted that it is possible for him to not hear or retain oral lessons. But here's the thing: if you were to sit me down at a music concert, an opera, an operetta, a theater show, a Broadway show, I would sit quietly until each intermission. And after the intermission, during the intermission, I might go nuts. But then when the show started again, I was consumed with every single minute until the end of it. I was able to pay attention, but it wasn't in the way that teachers in a classroom might desire. My mind was quick to sort out a problem, but I could only focus on one thing at a time, and often obsessively, if it was something that interested me. My handwriting was atrocious. I would scramble letters up. I had a hard time writing letters in the correct direction. And my parents were told to prepare for the fact that I might never, ever learn to read or write. That report of an extremely short attention span wasn't quite correct, however. I needed the proper motivation. The obsessive behaviors that can come with those on the autism spectrum when something is interesting made that literacy prediction false. You see, my siblings and my father were part of that church choir that I talked about earlier, and I desperately wanted to be part of that experience. So I was in the second grade, and I couldn't read yet. And under normal circumstances, children in the second grade should be able to read between 50 and 90 words per minute. The choir master had me read from a hymn book, and I just couldn't do it. He told me that until I could read, I wouldn't be able to join the choir. I was inconsolable. I felt stupid, and I felt left out. And this turned into fury. It was a red tricycle moment. And initially, my parents saw this as being oppositional behavior, but it occurred to my mother that they needed to steer that anger towards something more productive. I was fortunate. My dad was an English teacher, and he sat down with me every night writing letters, words, and then short sentences, longer sentences, and eventually short stories on the back of used dot matrix paper from work. We spent 2 months or so every night after supper drilling. Mom and Dad would find me drilling on my own, often having to force me, crying because I didn't want to stop to go to bed. A mere 10 weeks later, I went back to the choir master and said, "I want you to test me again." And he was incredulous. I had done so badly 3 months earlier. And after that test, he invited me to join the choir. I had learned to read in less than 70 days. And not only that, I was reading above grade level on both speed and comprehension. This is known as repetitive obsession. Those on the spectrum who find something interesting can find themselves can learn that thing very quickly if they're motivated. And if you're on the spectrum, you have tasks that you aren't particularly interested in. Something that's worked for me well is to change the rules on that task and turn it into a game. So when you're working with somebody on the spectrum, young, older, in between, a good tactic to figure out what is to figure out what amuses them, challenges them, interests them. They can excel under those circumstances. If a work task is proving difficult to complete, look for a way to make the task different and fall into something that amuses you or them. I had behavioral issues with pretty angry outbreaks. In retrospect, I realized I was having significant challenges with transitions. I was irritated by unexpected change. When I feel myself tensing up and I can recognize the fight or flight response occurring over something as unassuming as my wife asking me to use my car, or us making an unexpected shift in a shopping pattern, or somebody making a completely unexpected change request at work. For me, all these things are triggering, and I have to box breathe and ask myself, is this a crisis? Is this actually a problem? What are the implications if I push back? And before I started engaging in that strategy, my first response would be to argue, which had negative professional and personal impacts. But this never came from a place of trying to be actually oppositional or difficult. So if you work with somebody on the spectrum, you see a fight or flight response on what should seem like a simple conversation, take a breath yourself and ask this person, hey, what am I missing? Help me understand what the risk is here. And the moment you do that, you've shifted the context of your conversation. Your friend, your colleague, or partner might well go into solutioning rather than defending, explaining rather than fighting. At least that's my personal experience. Dr. Marcia Eckert wrote on the Asperger's 101 site, before schools and parents and families label behavioral problems as being oppositional defiant disorder, they need to explore the thinking of the child involved. Though certain explanations of behavior might seem intuitive to the parent or the teacher, behavior might not be intuitive to the child with autism spectrum disorder or nonverbal learning disorder. Ideally, once the teachers and parents get it, they'll be better able to be helpful and provide meaningful explanations and valuable insight instead of creating negative experience. It takes time, but it's worth it. Now, as a child, I didn't understand consequences. I literally didn't understand that if I did action A, it would lead to consequence B, good or bad. And I still have to think through scenarios, so I understand consequences of my action. I go through the scenarios rapidly in my brain over and over and over again until I decide what the action is that I'm going to take. And this happens incredibly quickly, but I have to think about it. I've intellectualized these responses rather than learned them through osmosis. I never really realized until adulthood that most people just naturally extrapolate consequences. Learning to do this has been essential to my success. And that doesn't mean that I don't understand kindness, decency, or goodness. And in fact, I'm highly sympathetic to the problems of others, and I'm eager to please. Remembering names is difficult. I've never been good at them. I remember places, faces, events, but keeping a person's name in my brain is very difficult. If I'm introduced to somebody, 5 minutes later, that person's name is gone. They jumble up like this picture of my name tags. All the names blend into nothing. And this isn't just in my personal professional relationships. I also have a hard time with names in books, movies, TV shows. I see pictures of people in my mind, but that doesn't connect to their name. Now, remember when I said that my testing indicated that my attention span was terrible? Learning new names is obviously tightly connected to short-term memory. So the best way for me to remember someone's name is to create a mnemonic device in the moment, associate the person's name with something else, repeat the person's name over and over and over again. But as you can imagine, if you're standing in front of somebody, that's a weird thing to do when you're first introduced to them. This can also be really awkward when you're asked to introduce someone you're with to another person, and it's someone that you should absolutely know the name of. So I plan ahead of social gatherings and meetings. I remind myself of people's names that I know will be there, and I write a note on my phone or on a piece of paper that I keep in my pocket. Stimulus and stress makes this far worse. So names can go out the window completely. I can even forget the name of a close friend. This gets even worse with crowds. Crowds freak me out. There's just too much stimulus. And I get anxious just thinking about going to a shopping mall. I find it exhausting meeting new people and figuring out how to negotiate those new relationships. So if I know I'm going to be in a situation like that, I'll often pick one person who I know and trust and say, hey, keep an eye out for me. I'm uncomfortable and I may need a way out. So if someone on your team is on the spectrum and they tell you that they're experiencing too much stimulation, believe them. Help them get to a quieter place. Lower lighting can often help. And don't be offended if they can't remember your name. If they ask you to remind them, just tell them. Time blindness is something that can be both a symptom of ADHD and those on the autism spectrum. When I was 12, my father was writing to the Ottawa Board of Education trying to get additional help for me. And one of the things that he wrote was, Matthew has no proper sense of time. It took him a very long time to understand yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He has no notion of days, years, months, or getting anywhere on time. And this is largely still true. I have to go overboard to make sure that I have calendar reminders set up to help me to get places on time. I can't estimate how long it'll take me to get point A or to point B, so I'll often use Google Maps to find out. Then I'll set multiple alerts on my phone to make sure that I do the right thing at the right time. For me, being a remote worker has been a huge boon to me because I can frequently just look at my calendar to see what comes next. I can struggle with deadlines, so I overcompensate. I start tasks early. And when I find something interesting, I can hyper focus and may miss meals. And I'll often look at the clock and wonder where the time went. On the opposite side, I can also be easily distracted. iPads, TVs, phones, they can all pull me off task. And I can find myself in a situation where, again, I don't know where the time's gone. And the things I intended to take care of are now late. So what to do? First, wear a watch. Smartwatches are awesome. I actually wear an Apple Watch and I have a Fitbit. People often ask me why I've got both of them. I'll say things like, well, I like the Fitbit community and blah, 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 blah. But the truth is, I use them to make sure that I've got prompts at the correct times. So have clocks in multiple rooms. Use technologies to prompt you like alarms, Siri, Google Home, or Alexa. Use a stopwatch to time tasks that you know you'll do repeatedly. So you intellectualize setting up of alerts where you should start to do a task. Then do the math backwards from the deadline to figure out when you should start. And then I double that time. My personal anxiety levels go through the roof when I realize I'm going to be imminently late. And that deregulates me. So I make mistakes at those times if I don't force myself into self-regulation. Things like trying to find a parking spot with a tight time constraint can completely unhinge me. If I have a critical set of tasks to complete after I arrive, my cognitive skills can have gone out the window because of the fight or flight response. As a result, I overcompensate. I always plan to be early. I usually give myself a 30-minute buffer. So if you're always early, you can never be late. I always give myself enough time to self-soothe and collect myself. Is 15 minutes enough? Do you need more? Do you always need to do certain tasks when you arrive somewhere? Plan for that. Use your intellect to compensate. When I was little, I had no sense of distance. I would run halfway up the front yard if I saw a car coming down the street to avoid it. Even at 12, I was still considered to be a hazard to myself and others because I wasn't good at judging how far something was away. My eye-hand coordination was poor, and I didn't have a sense of my own physical space. I still really don't have a sense of how far a mile is. Back in the 1970s and 80s, nobody possibly could have made the connection between my having short-sightedness, poor binocular vision, astigmatism, and ADHD. Because you see, ADD and ADHD wasn't added to the DSM until the 1980s. For the DSM, ADD in 1980, ADHD in 1987. But many of the ADD and ADHD symptoms are shared by binocular vision dysfunction. And this is the lack of the ability to properly focus because your eyes are misaligned. So those with ADHD and ADD can present with these symptoms as well. And in the 1970s, because they had no idea what ADD was, I was diagnosed as having a lazy eye, and I ended up wearing a patch over one eye to try and fix it. So what I'm saying here is that you can have these symptoms that sort of cross over and mask one another and don't quite fit what the diagnosis is, which is the reason earlier on I said sometimes you have to look at what the symptoms are and treat those symptoms. This is a long way of saying I overcompensate for almost everything, including distance, because I've never been able to properly judge it. One last piece of connected data that couldn't have been understood at the time is my red-green color blindness. So one of the things I talked about a little bit earlier was astigmatism. 33% of the general public has it. 73% of those on the autism spectrum have astigmatism. And then the National Library of Medicine reports about 8% of males have color blindness. So when you look at those on the autism spectrum, that jumps to roughly 30%, over 3.5 times more prevalent. The point is that some of these things that like autism spectrum disorder can be related to things like stigmatism, color blindness, poor binocular vision, and so on. But the medical community didn't make that connection to color blindness to autism until about 2017. I'm also direction blind. I have spatial impairments. This, I think, is related to my dyslexia. I have troubles with left and right. If somebody gives me directions to go north on First Street and then travel west on Green Avenue, I get lost. I operate best with landmarks. So again, giving myself extra time to get to places typically helps with that problem. Also, the advent of the smartphone with maps has been a blessing to me. Okay, I'm going to make a little bit of a curveball here. Shortly after I moved to Colorado to start my first professional job, I discovered a lump in my left testicle, and that lump tripled in size over the space of about 15 days. I needed surgery and chemotherapy, and the chemo was pretty painful at times, and to this day, my hearing's affected. I have neuropathy in my fingertips and permanent tinnitus in both ears. It was an intense time. I was in the office taking chemo through a port installed in my chest pretty much every weekday for about 2 months. I brought a work laptop to the clinic, and I spent my days coding an application for work. And when I got home at night, I would spend my evenings curled up, sweating as a miserable little ball. In 2017, the European Association of Urology made a connection, however, between the prevalence of testicular cancer and learning disabilities. The work's lead author, Dr. Maren Ashford, St. George's Hospital in London, said, "We found that people with learning disabilities are not only more likely to develop testicular cancer, but they're also more likely to die from it than the general population. And people with learning difficulties are 4 times more likely to die of testicular cancer than the general population." For me, this was another data point connecting a lot of dots. And I'm going to be clear, cancer for me wasn't negative on balance. It actually represented another step forward into my being less rigid. Because if you remember when I talked about my childhood, how I was impulsive, short-tempered at times, often inflexible, obsessed with a single thing, and bad at transitions. I could be impatient with people. I'd often quibble about small things and found it extremely difficult to let those things go, often to the detriment of my personal and professional relationships. This experience forced me to confront the fact that the small stuff doesn't matter. I learned that holding on to trifles and letting them stress you out was counterproductive. Because when you're being treated for something that will 100% kill you otherwise, your perspective can change. Now, I don't want you guys out there in the audience to have cancer to learn this lesson. Learn from me. So if you're feeling overly stressed by the small stuff and it causes you to argue with people, it's probably worth taking a deep breath and saying, does it really matter? Will my relationship be better if I breathe instead of argue? And I'm going to give a little public service announcement now. If you're a guy, particularly a guy with learning disabilities, do self-checks in the shower regularly. This kind of cancer is relatively common in young men, but highly curable if you catch it early. When I finished high school, I wasn't ready to go to university. I wasn't mature enough. I didn't have enough self-awareness. High school had been difficult. And while I'd never failed any classes, I had an extremely hard time concentrating. I was socially extremely awkward. I didn't understand people well. They didn't understand me. I misread intentions, and I was often bullied. And in the 9th grade, I was taped to the football goalpost 2 feet off the ground. Later in high school, my locker was broken into, and a snake, a couple of crayfish, and a fetal pig from the biology lab were left in my locker, left stinking formaldehyde. And this stigma from junior high had followed me. I was alone, bullied, largely without a tribe. And every single success since then has been colored with, somebody is going to figure out that I'm worthless. For me, imposter syndrome had already set in. I felt happiest when I was able to do things all on my own, things that required repetitive actions. This meant that I excelled in art classes where repetition and techniques like cross-hatching were valued. I was able to express myself in some pretty bizarre ways rather than being frowned for it. So I received praise for that creativity. So after high school, I decided with the help of my parents to take a vocational art program for high school graduates. I worked at a coffee shop at the same time, but I was really adrift, and neither my parents nor I had no idea what was to come next. I half-heartedly engaged in that program, left before the year ended, and I was deeply sad. I felt like a fraud, a fake, and I felt useless. But my father saw an advertisement in the local newspaper for a tiny liberal arts university in the eastern townships of Quebec. The school is nestled in the convergence of two rivers. It was established in 1843, with much of the architecture reflecting its affiliation with Oxford and Cambridge. And when we toured the school, it was immediately clear that the school's size, at 1,700 students, would be perfect for me. I applied in fine arts and theater, was accepted, and received several scholarships, which seemed absolutely crazy to me at the time. My largest class was 40 people. My smallest was 7. I started school feeling like a fraud, and I was just waiting for a teacher to call me out and for it to fall apart. I was waiting to be bullied and shamed. But these things didn't happen, and I flourished. One of the things that's really important to know is that high-functioning people with ADD and ADHD can do well in the workplace and at school, but undiagnosed, they might attribute symptoms to anxiety and depression. It can affect your self-esteem. You can feel like you have character flaws that lead to feelings of shame. You can have a lack of confidence, and you might get praised for how hard and long you work. But part of the reason that you're working so long and so hard is to compensate for your inability to stay on task for longer periods of time. This can make you feel like a fraud. It can lead to that feeling somebody's going to figure out I'm just faking it. So I've got one more story here, and it's really general advice. It doesn't apply only to those with learning disabilities or neurodivergence, but even so, it's doubly important for us. After I finished my bachelor's degree, I moved back to Ottawa, and I worked as a lighting tech for a local theater. And I realized while doing that lighting work that I really didn't want to be a theater technician my whole life. So I enrolled in a nonprofit management program at the University of Ottawa, which led to a job with an experimental dance company. I'd also applied to go to grad school in Virginia to complete a Master of Fine Arts, and I thought I was going to focus on art marketing. That job at the dance company was curious. It represented my first step into becoming a software technologist. I leveraged what I learned at Le Groupe, that's the dance company, when I attended grad school. Now, it was 1995, and I was hired to work on the website. And I glibly said, sure, I can figure that out. Now, back in 1995, I didn't have Google to Google what's a website. I did know what the internet was because I was using Telnet to log into a crazy system called Lambda Mu, a giant free-form multi-user game, which I met my wife there. So I asked a friend on Lambda Mu what this web thing was, and he was helpful and pointed me to some information. And suddenly, I was a webmaster. Now, I had no idea what I was doing, but even so, I think most people were in the same boat because in 1995, there are only 23,500 websites in the world. But one of the absolutely insane things that company did this summer, remember this is 1995, was to collaborate in real time with multiple dance companies in different cities across Canada. They were working with the Canadian Broadcasting Company to do live feeds between the different sites. Nobody had tried something like that before, collaboration at distance with performers, and it completely blew me away. So when I arrived down at Virginia Tech, I explained my experience that summer to my committee. And my committee was incredible. They allowed me to gather together a coalition of different departments to experiment with bleeding-edge technology for my thesis work. And then rather than researching arts administration, I produced 3 multimedia works, each layering on top of the previous, experimenting with the web, imagery, live-action theater, streamed live feeds, and pre-recorded video. I had to learn to code, to manage people, to string together networks, and to learn video codecs. So this boy that was never supposed to learn to read or write had transformed into a technologist. All of this had me working with the university after graduating, teaching copyright law, videography, and developing the first database-driven tourism website with the Virginia Tourism Board. This is back in 1998. So never be frightened to ask for what you need and want, because the worst thing that can happen is somebody can say no to you. Don't be frightened to do bold things. Do something that takes you completely out of your comfort zone, and assume if you keep applying pressure to it, you will make it work. Be fearless. Don't let the perceived consequence of failure cripple you, because the real consequence of success can be life-changing. Now, at the beginning, I started talking about how I started down this journey to advocacy. And I was afraid to start talking about my own personal mental health challenges. I was frightened to discuss my learning disabilities. My neurodivergence had been something that I had heavily masked. I didn't want to be different. I didn't want to be perceived as being different. I didn't want my professional career or my personal relationships to be prejudiced or destroyed because of these aspects of myself. And when I was a child through the school of hard knocks, I learned to hide this part of me. I learned that I should put it away in a safe little corner and to protect those dirty little secrets. But becoming a dad changed all of that. Remember at the beginning, I talked about this because I had to talk about these things as my daughter's advocate. So it was a few years after cancer, my wife and I decided that we wanted to adopt a child. We always knew that we wanted to be parents, and we adopted through the foster care system because so many terribly abused children in the US need parents. We adopted this 5-year-old kid, this little girl, and she'd had a very difficult first few years of her life, emotional problems that in many ways mirrored my own masked issues. I wouldn't have understood my own challenges if I hadn't been confronted with her and had to learn everything that I could about reactive attachment disorder, ADHD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and bipolar disorder. If it hadn't been for my daughter, I never would have really understood my own ADHD and dyslexia, and I certainly wouldn't have had the realization that I was on the autism spectrum. And I never, ever would have had the courage to talk about these things publicly. So I have a few last takeaways for you before I pause for questions. The first is, it's estimated that 1% of the population has autism spectrum disorder. With software developers, that jumps to 4%. 4% of us reporting it. 4.4% of the population has ADHD, and 20% of people have some level of dyslexia. People like me, high-functioning autists, gravitate to industries like software development. So you've got these people in your life, and some of them are masking, so you might not know who all of them are, and they may even not know that they have this disorder. So keeping that in mind, use empathy. If you're on the spectrum, you have to work twice as hard to understand how others perceive the world. And if you aren't on the spectrum, you need to work twice as hard to understand how your autist friend, colleague, or partner thinks. Secondly, make patience central to your life. Patience is a muscle that needs to be exercised. Those with ADHD and autism become irritable more easily than atypical people. That can lead to outbreaks of anger. And practically, this means if you're neurodivergent, you really need to be monitoring why you feel what you do. And if you're neurotypical, help your friend by watching for warning signs or triggers. And 3, kindness should be your go-to, even when you're feeling upset. Assume people are approaching a situation or a problem with good intentions, unless they prove otherwise. Be kind. Now, if you're interested in following more of what I have to talk about, I've been doing a series of short videos. I have a channel on YouTube, which I'll continue adding video shorts to in the future. You can use the QR code on the screen, or you can go to bit.ly/myneurodivergentbrain for that series of videos. And then finally, a little self-plug. I am currently running for the Drupal Association board right now. I want to focus on DEI within the Drupal community, and I would be super, super grateful for your vote if you're qualified and you feel comfortable having me represent you. Thank you very much for listening, and now I'd be happy to take some questions.
Okay, we do have a couple questions, and our backstage is going to put the first one in there. What have been the benefits of exploring a diagnosis of ASD and all that as an adult?
Yeah, so I would say that really it's self-understanding. It is self-actualization. It is being able to put all of the pieces together that I didn't understand before. Like I said early in the presentation, I'd figured out most of my coping mechanisms before I went to university in 1992, but I didn't understand why I was having to engage in those coping mechanisms. The biggest thing for me was literally just going, oh, now I get it. Now I understand who I am. Now I understand the context. Instead of just running through life constantly being confused. That's the biggest thing.
Very good. Thank you. All right. For your next question, we have how often do you disclose your diagnosis in work settings, and is it a positive experience?
Great question. Until DrupalCon Amsterdam in 2019, never, ever, ever. I was terrified. I thought that it could undo me. Um, when I decided that when I was looking around the room, so to speak, and I saw so many other people who were struggling and having the same kinds of experiences as I was having, and when I started being an advocate for my daughter, and I sat on the board of directors for a charter school, where I really did focus on learning disabilities as part of my board activities, and became an advocate there as well. I decided that I was going to make that jump. And when I looked out in the audience at that presentation, so many of my colleagues were there, and it was sort of a kind of shrug. Okay, I've jumped in both feet first now, and that literally turned into Pfizer asking me to do a keynote presentation for an internal conference for all of digital. And our digital practice is giant. It's an enormous digital practice. My boss knows. Most of my colleagues know. I have a mentor who is one of my safe people, who will virtually kick me under the desk if I'm doing something that maybe isn't what I should be doing from a behavior standpoint. I'm pretty good at that kind of stuff at this juncture, though. Um, and recently I joined one of the working groups at Pfizer as a DEI ambassador focused on disabilities. At this point, I'm very transparent about it, and my experience has been that everybody appreciates that transparency, and it has not done anything but improve my work conditions. Would have I done it early in my career? I don't know. Early in my career, I was constantly trying to prove myself, right? And at this junction in my career, people know what I'm capable of. They know I'm good at my job. They know that they can count on me. They know that in a pinch, I'm the guy that they can reach out to in an emergency. They know that I get stuff done. So there's I think there's sort of a balance there, right? You need to be super comfortable with who you are and where you are in your life, I think, before you start being as transparent as I've started being in my life. Um, and there's no shame, honestly, in masking until you feel like you're in a position where you can feel safe. Safety is the biggest part of it, right? If you don't feel safe, you're not going to do well in any kind of situation, whether it's work or personal or whatever.
Cool. And I have to say, on a personal note, I've known you for many years, and I was at Amsterdam, and I was so very impressed by that your talk at that point, because I had no idea what that it was coming, because I had no idea, and I had known you for so long. So I really appreciated your opening up about that. So Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah.
So final question, we have, how has your being neurodivergent yourself affected your parenting a neurodivergent child?
I am so much better at it. So one of the things that my kiddo has struggled with in school over the years is different ways of learning. And I could quite literally say, "Oh, kiddo, I see exactly what's going on. Your teacher might not recognize it, but you're having trouble. You're having trouble with multiplication tables because of A, B, and C, right?" And she would say, "Yes." And I would say, "Okay, here's some coping mechanisms. Have you ever heard of Napier's bones? It's a way of doing your 9 times tables in your fingers. There are all kinds of things that you can do, all kinds of sort of workarounds, different ways of thinking, different ways of doing tasks. That if you're neurodivergent, you've you've gone through those experiences. So for my kid, I was able to put myself into her shoes quite a bit more easily than I would have been otherwise. Same with her challenges around being rigid and having difficulties with transitions and having difficulties in overstimulated situations. Often, I would be in a situation where I could almost feel the exact same things that she was feeling in those circumstances, um, albeit with a higher executive function. So being able to manage those feelings better myself and help her remove herself from those situations. As an example, any kid that's at Disney World really wants to be at Disney World, right? And it doesn't matter how overstimulated things get. There's a fear of missing out if suddenly you're leaving earlier than you would have expected. So there have been times like at Disney World or at an airport where my kiddo may be having a meltdown, and I'm recognizing it's not because she's being oppositional. It's not because she's being a bad kid. It's literally there's too much going on. And I'll just take her. I would just take her to a quiet place, find ways to calm her down, help her do things like again the tapping. That is a very common soothing technique. It's actually used in therapists' offices called the EMDR, where they actually might have a couple of little tappers in your hands that give very very low electric shocks going back and forth, and it helps synchronize different parts of your brain. So doing things like that certainly helped her in those circumstances, and it put her in a position that ultimately, she was able to go to community college and so on. She lives on her own now, and is able to function pretty well without additional help. So for me, those experiences were essential to helping my kid grow up to be a whole human being.
Wonderful, wonderful. All right. Thank you very much, Matthew. That was a great talk, and I really appreciate you coming on to the show. Just a reminder, we're always looking for speakers and new voices in the accessibility community. Another reminder that for those of you with the AAP certifications, Ally Talks is part of getting your continuing education. We make a conscious effort to include marginalized groups in our speaker lineups. If you have any ideas to how to make Ally Talks more friendly to all, please let us know. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. You're here already. You might as well just click the button. And we also have an open collective page. Follow us on the X thing or Twitter or whatever you want to call it this week. And we're also on Mastodon for those who want to do other things as well. Shanta, thank you. If you're interested in speaking, please let us know. You reach out to us at info@allytalks.com, or go to the website. Thanks for another great week. We'll see you, or another great month, and we'll see you next month. And for Matthew and Andy and Ann, who are in the background making everything work, thanks a lot, and thanks for playing.
Thanks for inviting me.